You are listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Tools and burials, plants and seeds, Neanderthals. All these things we make no apology are the study of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast, episode 11. I'm your host, Sarah, with my co-host, Ken Fader, and today is part 2 of our special 2-part interview with Jeb Card. Jeb is a bit of an authority on the political and religious contexts and underpinnings of the modern pseudo-archaeology and pseudo-history movement. We expand to reach a variety of topics throughout this 2-part special. We hope you stick around for both parts of our interview with Jeb Card.
Funny beady blokes you will see are a staple of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs.
Buse, I always forget his first name. He wrote this book on Bigfoot. He's pretty much, it's all about masculinity. It's all about going into the woods and masculinity. It's this symbol of like nature and et cetera, but it fits into this stuff beautifully. And, you know, there's politics behind it.
The gender politics of some of this stuff really does interest me a lot because, like, with the aliens thing and the whole coming to Earth and having relations with the Earth women, it's like, man, you know, either Earth women are the most desired thing in the universe, or it just truly does suck to be a woman because everything wants to impregnate you.
Well, that's, oh my God. I mean, so, you know, I mean, that's...
And apparently you have the universal womb as well, because apparently it all comes out. None of it dies in uterine.
Well, that was the beautiful thing. I mean, I've heard people talk about this, and I think it was maybe the writers who talked about this with Alien, the original Alien. You know, they pretty much inverted that. It's a guy who... serves the role, and it works perfectly with all this, you know, mechanosexual imagery that Giger entered into this, and it's like it works amazingly. It's funny you say that for a couple of reasons. One is I got a catalog earlier this year for a press which will go unnamed, but they write a lot about excursions that might have events on them in a manner that has no limits, and you may be able to guess who I'm talking about. The editor has been on Ancient Aliens, and that should give you enough. All of the imagery, all the illustrations that weren't book covers were all from like classic golden era pulps, like big-eyed monsters and like, you know, women in like shiny little things and guys with like ray guns. And I'm like, so you're just like, you're not even like pretensing anymore. You're just like, yeah, I know what this is. But the other reason you mentioned that the gender politics, the whole alien abduction thing, you know, that has that running through it, especially because there was this whole, and this is blown up. If you look this up, all I need to say is Google Bud Hopkins, Google Emma Woods. That's all I'm going to say about that. If you're interested in this, and it's a blank show of epic proportions. Again, I'm actually self-censoring, which is amazing to me. It's all about these therapists or researchers hypnotizing people. And there were some really weird dynamics.
Yeah.
Some crazy weird dynamics there, which again, if you Google those things I just mentioned, you'll find, and the people have defended themselves and all that. And I don't want to talk about it, you know, it gets crazy, but there is. And a lot of people have commented on this. A lot of the stuff that then infects pseudo-archaeology actually comes from that particular corner of UFO belief in the 80s. And then gets pushed back. You know, that's where the gray alien comes from, all this stuff in there. And so to kind of, you know, bring it back to Ken's question, why has this gone crazy? You know, and never mind the bigger politics, is that these things all talk to each other. And it's long before the internet. You know, getting back to the pulps, people did stuff like the internet. Like we talk about, you know, YouTube comments, message boards, email, Facebook, social media. People used the letters columns of like amazing stories and weird tales to do that in the 1940s. And not just about science fiction, but about the origins of pseudo-archaeology. Like I've mentioned the Shaver mysteries a couple of times. This is sort of proto-UFO stuff that also brought in like Atlantis and theosophy and ancient stuff that's all the foundations of Ancient Aliens. That got built organically in the letters columns of amazing stories. It would be
Yeah.
recognizable to anybody who knows what a blog is. We think these are new ways of communicating. It's only cheaper and faster.
Well, it's much faster. It's instantaneous as opposed to waiting for the next issue of Amazing Stories to come out where you can read those things.
Well, it's probably why the spelling's worse. They had editors.
Hey,
there
now,
you go.
man.
Absolutely.
Hey, now.
You know.
Well, no, I think it has changed the conversation, though, because, like you said, you have to wait for the next episode to come out. Yes, you probably read the article and had a knee-jerk reaction, and then you wrote your letter, and then you had to send it off, and you had to wait. And I mean, they didn't publish every letter that that they got, and blah, 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 blah. The internet feeds that more because, like on a blog, unless you're moderating the comments, which a lot of people don't do because it's kind of a pain in the butt,
Right.
You could read an article and then just immediately post your thoughts about it. And then you can even tell it to tell you when someone else replies back. So you can have an instantaneous conversation. So you can just get as angry and as flamey as you want to get.
Oh yeah, but it's funny you say that they would, they would print in every letter. So very capsule story. Basically, when I talk about these shaver mysteries, it was this guy. He was an arc welder, and at one point, his arc welder started, producing the voices that he heard from the underground evil Deros people, because that happens. And he started writing about it. And so he started writing these very disjointed letters, Richard Shaver did, and he had sent them to Amazing Stories, which was, pulp. This is the height of the pulps. This is the height. Science fiction had been sort of this tawdry thing, and it was beginning to emerge. This is right when you get your Asimovs and your Heinleins and your Bradburys. It's right after your Howards and your Lovecrafts and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And he sends these letters in. And he sends them into Amazing Stories, and one of the editors there, for reasons largely of spite at his boss, who he hated for a number of reasons. His boss was like, "Don't print this. This is they didn't have it back then, but this is tinfoil hat garbage." Is basically it. And he threw it away. Palmer grabbed it out of the trash can and printed it to spite him, and he cleaned it up. And he also knew there was something to it. And he prints these things and says they're real. And of course, the guy sending them believed they were real. Whether Palmer did is a very open question. He said he did, but he said a lot of things. And he started printing them. And they sold like hotcakes.
Right.
Yeah.
And then people started writing in about their own encounters in the caverns with the evil Deros, and started expanding this open source mythology. And Palmer printed those, and he would print the wildest ones, not the best ones, the ones that sold more. And he sensationalized more and more, to the point where sci-fi readers revolted and said, "No more. We're trying to class our act up." He got fired. We didn't get fired. He left. He founds Fate magazine. He's writing all about this stuff in 1945, 1946. Who do you think printed the first stories about this new thing that get called flying saucers?
Fate magazine.
And he started printing it as an extension of the Shaver mysteries. He has been called the man who invented the UFO.
Nice.
And so all of this stuff was tied heavily to pulp fiction, and they were doing it back and forth. Fate magazine still exists. You can still get it.
Oh, yeah.
And it printed Pseudo-Archaeology from day one. It was a major organ for that stuff, and it was melding it all from day one. And nothing's really changed. And all it was warmed over theosophy, which was the origin of ancient aliens. Jason will talk about all this, but it's basically warmed over Victorian pseudo-archaeology of Atlantis and Lemuria and Mu and root races and all of that. And none of that's really gone away. The thing is there was that period from like 1940 to about 1980 when it was mainstreamed as astronauts and science. We're not looking for the sons of Cain. We're not looking for that. We're out looking for Gigantopithecus blackie.
Right.
Oh, wow.
We're not looking for demons. We're not looking for spirits. We're looking for recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis. And that's kind of gone out of fashion. And I think that's the thing, is it's sort of this bubble that came and went, and now we're back in sort of the bad old days.
So now, Jeb, are there are there any statistics? You can understand that there are people who watch these shows who are attracted to all of this stuff, and who will tell you, well, it's just interesting to think about. But what do we have statistics concerning? Well, what percentage of people who are watching this stuff who in fact are true believers and are not just saying, well, but it's fun, it's interesting.
I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, a Nielsen rating won't give you that.
Right.
But I mean, I remember as early as when you guys were doing cult archaeology and creationism, you were like polling college students on that question, which of course had the problem that they were a weird.
It's not a random or representative sample, of course not.
Yeah. But there's been some sense. Probably the best book on this topic. It doesn't directly talk about pseudo-archaeology. It only skims it, but it talks about these other ones. Is Paranormal America, and it's got a whole bunch of co-authors. The one I remember is Chris Bader, but they actually have deep polling from the Baylor Religion Study in America, which does actually touch on this. The thing is that those kinds of studies, they document numbers like, you ask Americans if they believe in a literal Satan, and you'll see numbers like 60-some%.
Right.
You'll see numbers on like, do you believe in UFOs? And of course, what does that mean? It's about between 40 and 50% of Americans.
Right.
Now, how hard they believe it, that's where the Paranormal America book, which has like multivariate stats, it breaks it down. They have degrees. It's a lot, which is a very sciencey thing to say.
Very definitive.
Yeah, but you guys have talked about the fringe of the fringe in the past.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not so sure that's true.
Right, okay.
I mean, that's the problem, is I suspect it's not. And there's been a number of recent studies. I was reading one earlier this week on looking at conspiracy theory and how it interacts, and anti-science interacts with like political partisanship.
Right.
And it found that the crosstabs basically suggested that a biblical literalist worldview is the primary determiner. Like you could once you take that out, political partisanship really doesn't say that you're going to be more or less anti-science.
Right.
So it's your religious worldview as to how
it's not the only one, but it was the biggest one they found. Yeah.
See, I find it disheartening that there has become such a divide between science and religion, because I don't personally see why there needs to be that divide. But then again, I was not raised religious, so that wasn't drilled into me at a young age either. I don't have to recover from a religious worldview in order to accept science. But it upsets me that it is such a large percentage of the view of science. You know what I'm saying?
Well, there's a religious background, and here I would frankly punt to somebody who's a more dedicated student of American Christianity. But I think the thing there is there's also a sea change in what were called the mainline churches, the sort of waspy mainline churches, primarily in the Northeast and Midwest, having a lot of cultural capital in much of the 20th century. And that's not quite as true as it once was. And that brings different attitudes towards literalism. But here I am probably speaking off of what I should. As a citizen, I can. As a scholar, I'm like, I can't say that. Because that's, wait a minute, you study pottery from Central America? Why are you talking about this? But that gets into a really complicated thing. I'm still recovering from having gone to the Creation Museum last month. Or a month
I haven't gone, but I really want to go. I'm just trying to find a way to not give them $20.
It's $30 actually.
Oh no, that's even worse.
Well, we went to the planetarium, so that would impact the cost. Yes, they have a planetarium.
How does that even work?
I know.
Is there a giant ice dome, and you get to stare at the ice dome?
No. I'm not really sure I want to spoiler it. Wait, yeah, I do. I will say this. First off, if you are somebody who does not like biblical creationism as an explanation for the past, if you're like, oh, I have bad ideas about that museum before visiting, all I'm going to say is, whatever you think, it's more extreme than you thought before you walked in.
Holy crap.
Yeah, and I've been to the UFO Museum in Roswell. I've been to the Mothman Museum in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. I've been to the Museum of the Weird in in Austin. I went looking for the Honey Island Swamp Monster at the UCM Museum in Abita Springs, Louisiana. This was easily something completely different.
Sure.
In one way, it was also the cost. Now, I don't mean the cost to get in. It is a high cost, high tech, high production cost place.
Yeah, I know that they've put quite a bit of money into the museum itself just for their display. I mean, they've got some pretty high-techy stuff going on in there.
Yes, they do. And
is it subsidized, Jeb? Do you know? I mean, the $30 isn't covering it, is it?
It's not state subsidized.
No, I understand, but
yeah. Well, remember that was.
subsidized?
Remember, they're about to sue Kentucky. It looks like over that. So
over that arc,
yeah, because they're not going to get that, at least at the moment. And so it looks like they're going to file suit. I don't know if they filed suit yet, but it looks like they will. And I'm just working off a press there. I don't have any inside information.
Yeah,
but I don't know their finances. I know they've had lots of donors. Which you know, quote unquote real museums do. You know, I mean, you know, they do as well.
Right.
But the number I've heard is 20 million. It's got to be higher than that. They've had to put more than 20 million. It's amazing, actually, in many respects. That's going to be on the reviews now. It's amazing. Jeb Card, Miami University.
Right, there you go.
But no, it is technologically impressive. And the planetarium, first off, maybe other planetariums are like this now. It was a LCD projector, first off. I'm like, that's a little low tech. They talked about it was very cosmosy. It was the vast distances and wonder of space. And I'm like, this is the worst evidence ever if you're a young Earth creationist. You understand that, people. And it actually broke me out of the rest of it. That's why I brought up how well done the rest was, because this section wasn't. If you want to have your heart broken, if you are somebody who cares about the past, go see their display on Lucy.
Oh, no. Terrifying.
Yeah, you may be like, I really want to go. I'm not going to make a recommendation on air. But
they won't be able to say as recommended by archaeologist Jeb Card.
Well, they wouldn't have been able to say that anyway. But
but they will try.
Precisely. Yeah, it was a thing. And there is pseudo-archaeology there, and there is cryptozoology there. I bought a number of books there, and you're like, thanks for giving them money. But I bought a number of books there that openly use things like the Columbian Flyers.
Oh, sure.
Yonaguni, and you're like, what does that have to do with creationism?
Yeah,
good
that's
question.
Exactly my question.
Good question.
Yeah, I was gonna say, can you kind of
the Piri?
We've jumped topic again.
Yeah,
can you kind of
the Piri Reis map? All these classics of pseudo-archaeology of hyperdiffusion or ancient aliens, they're all in there.
But is that simply science wrong?
Yeah. I think it is. I think it is. And
because I know creationists will try to use the Ica stones as evidence that humans lived with dinosaurs.
Well,
ignoring all the other things.
So they have a section in the beginning before you even pay, and this will actually get us back on topic. I'm like, oh my God, I suddenly got us back on topic. Before you even pay, there's a section called, I think they call it the Dragon Invasion, Dragon Encounter, something about dragons. They put this in at one point to kind of boost the place. James Below, a colleague of mine, he's got another chapter in this Alabama volume we have coming out on the creation of it, because he did ethnography with the team. He's published on this. It's amazing work. And that is an endorsement. So you go there, and this was actually the part I was most interested in for several reasons. They have this whole thing about witnessing. They're basically like, look, dragons are dinosaurs. Behemoth, Leviathan, St. George, all of these are dinosaurs. So if there are dinosaurs that are witnessed by humans, therefore young Earth, therefore. And so they have, and I'm just going to go through what they have in just the dragon exhibit. And we can do a quick, like, what is this? They have the top Prom Stegosaurus, that part of the Angkor complex, the temple at Top Prom. That is not a Stegosaurus, but people think it looks like one. They have imagery of that. They have the Sarush gates of Babylon, which are supposed to be dragons from the early 1920s. People were saying that. German explorers, Koldovai, was saying that they have imagery of that. They have the Narmer palette, with those kind of
yeah, of course.
Yeah, the cat with like the interlocking like serpentine necks that they borrowed from the Sumerians on the back of the Narmer palette. They're like, oh, those are sauropods.
They
have that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Wow.
They have that.
So they're just reaching, basically.
They have they have copies of Moche pottery with the spondylus monster, as Chris Donnan calls it, from South America, but it looks vaguely like a dragon. So they have that. They have Nessie, Ogopogo, these lake monsters. They have that famous cryptozoological kind of folklore about cowboys that shot a pterodactyl in the 1890s that got into the press back then. All of this is in the opening of the Creation Museum, and some of it's pseudo-archaeology of the classic kind, some of it's cryptozoology. It's all blended together.
Hey everyone, I'm back with Jordan Harbinger from The Art of Charm. Jordan, we've been growing our listener base over the last few months. Why don't you tell everyone again what they can get out of listening to the Art of Charm podcasts?
Hey, so what we do at the Art of Charm, especially on the show, is we take tools that ultra high performers use and we make them accessible and we teach them to you. So what we primarily specialize in is relationship building, which is powerful for people in your field because any academic field or any field period, because as everyone knows, it's all about who you know, right? And most people say that like, well, it's all about who you know, and they don't like that because they're on the losing side of that equation. What we want to do is put you on the winning side of that equation where you say, wow, I'm glad it's all about who you know because maybe this isn't the strongest, or maybe I don't want to sleep under my desk and try to outwork everybody, or maybe I'm doing both of those things, but I still want an edge. Your relationships are what's going to deliver that. So we teach people how to do that, especially people who have kind of an analytical mindset, like a lot of people you might know, if you know what I mean. And they can apply these very practical skills. So we don't say things like, just put yourself out there. I don't do that. I say, all right, what you're going to do is this, and then you're going to get this information. You're going to connect these people together. You're going to follow up in this amount of time, and you're going to say this. And that makes it a heck of a lot easier because there's no guesswork and there's no fingers crossed, hope this works type of system. It's a real system.
Awesome. Check out the Art of Charm podcast wherever you get podcasts and at www.artofcharm.com.
Which does kind of bring us back to what we were
Yeah,
talking
I know.
about.
I was actually amazed just when I thought of it. I was like, oh my God, that's shockingly
excellent job.
Shockingly efficient. But no, all that's in there. And so the books they sell have all those things I mentioned. They have a whole book there. This one's amazing. It is Von Daniken straight up. It is called, I don't know if I can reach it. I cannot reach it with my cords. I'd have to like Jedi pull the thing off from a distance. Wait. Can I? I think I actually can reach it if I don't turn my head. This thing is about dire dragons. And if you open it up, it is
dire dragons?
It is literally like dire, like dire.
Like a dire wolf.
Yes, but I think it's just that they are dire. And what it is it's literally around the world, pictures from some of the rock art that Ken has seen out west.
Right. Oh, of course.
Or Moche pottery. I am looking, for example, at something, a supposed petroglyph from Palenque. I'm like, really? A sauropod petroglyph from Utah, from the Kachina Bridge there, or the Moab Mastodon. And more or less high quality images are sort of like scientific reconstruction drawings of dinosaurs and making them look exactly the same.
Wow.
So I'm looking at, for example, a gold angel coin from England of King Edward IV, where they have an angel stomping on a dragon. And next to it, they have a scientific reconstruction of what it should actually look like in the exact same pose, of a Carnotaurus sastri, which I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. That's what it's really showing.
See, and these kind of things aggravate me because the same people who will try to tell you that the dinosaurs, that you can't rely on like carbon dating and that kind of stuff to give you a reliable date for these things, are the same people who will turn around and use something like the 65 million year old spider fossil that was found several years ago, or the T-Rex soft tissue. And I'm like, you can't use these ancient things and then use them as evidence for young Earth. A, your math is off by like light years, and B, you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, but picking. It is cherry picking.
Yeah, it's very cherry picking, and it irritates me because because they can make a convincing argument to someone who doesn't understand what they're talking about. And so they feel like, at least this is how I perceive it, they feel like they have made a convincing argument. Like the person that used the spider thing on me, and he was on fire. He thought he had me. And I was like, your math is off, and it's a giant fossil. Yes, it looks like a spider, but it's like 3 times the size of a regular spider. Your dates are off, and as far as the dinosaur soft tissue, if you read the article that she's published on the soft tissue that they have found, not only in just the T-Rex, but in some others, it's not soft tissue. There's no DNA in it. It's just like this fluke of preservation.
But it is cherry picking, as Ken says. It's anomaly hunting, and there's like this linguistic element, and this gets back to that Honduras city thing, where they're like, it's a lost city, it's a mystery, it's vanished. Once you say those words, now this is not what they intended, obviously.
Right.
But once you start using those words, people will hook onto them. There's, sure. I'm sure there's like a linguistic study for that, but I study pottery in Central America, so I don't know it. But once you say those words, there's an association, and so certain things are predictable. I mean, you can predict. I'll read some story, and it's like, I know how this is going to be used. You know, a classic example, or not classic example, but example I'm waiting for it to all go horribly wrong. I don't know if you all have been following. There's this recent genetics that shows that there was a population push about the time of the Beaker people, about 4000 BC-ish, into Europe from Russia.
Okay.
And you both, as students of pseudo-archaeology and the use of archaeology for political and racial ideology in the past, can know exactly where that's going.
Yeah.
I mean, somebody's going to call that Aryan at some point. Of course they are.
Right.
And you can kind of start to predict that, even if it's not the same thing. So it's like, this is 65 million years old. You can't use this. Yeah, but you don't know what it is. There's something weird about it. Therefore, it's mine. Because it's a mystery, and I monger mysteries.
Mm-hmm.
And once you realize that everything's up for game, and you don't have to have it be like a logical sense to it, other than the logic of connecting the dots in any way you want, if the stakes were not so high, it would be a wonderful game.
Well,
yeah,
you hear that all the time. It's this. The argument is, well, it could be, so therefore it is.
Yeah. And if you didn't care about the reality, if you're like, if you don't have to marry it back to evidence, then it makes for a wonderful session of like Dungeons and Dragons. It's that's how I think of this stuff.
True story.
That's how I think of this stuff.
It's like, or ghost stories around a campfire, where ultimately it doesn't make any difference if there's any such thing as ghosts. You still get scared, and it's fun. It's just that then you go to the next step and say, well, but wait a minute, that's actually real. And that disconnect between just the fun part of the storytelling and the reaction that people have, there's a disconnect between that and the belief that, no, there really are ghosts out there, and there are demons and aliens, and that underlies what should be our understanding of the world.
Well, and you know what? And again, you guys, I think, talked on the Noah's Ark one. If people believe these things, as long as they're not getting into sort of your wheelhouse of material evidence, well, fine.
Yeah.
But so there's the scientific angle, and then there's the other one of, if people believe these things and then they go and start praying outside your house because it's full of demons, and by demons they mean you.
Right.
Or
exactly.
they start changing education laws.
Right.
Or what's in
or just the textbooks in general.
Or science policy of how we should do this or how we should do that.
But see, that's a whole that crosses into some very difficult territory, because as we kind of tried to say in the creationism episode, it is hard. It's one thing for me to say, show me your evidence that aliens were on the planet whatever years ago, because I'm asking for you have made a claim that there was a physical presence, and therefore there should be evidence of this presence in the archaeological record. When it comes to religion, the problem I encounter is that it's so ingrained into people's identity of themselves that any attack on religion is a personal attack, regardless if you mean it for it to be or not.
Uh-huh.
So, you get that knee-jerk reaction because you've personally attacked somebody, and you come to that whole situation of, well, I experienced this, and you can't tell me that wasn't real. And it's like, well, I can, but since you can't prove that it was real, I also cannot prove that it was not, because we're not talking about something that actually occurred anywhere except maybe in your mind.
Well, and I think that's why the conspiracy theory stuff adheres so well to things like pseudo-archaeology, because if it's about what's going to happen to you in the afterlife, or did your dead relative, or did Jesus Christ as your Savior visit you, you're right. That is a personal experience.
Right.
Was there a flood?
We can prove that.
Did animals evolve? Did plants evolve? Did Atlantis exist? Did Nephilim do these things? Those literalist things then butt heads. So if you're coming from a more metaphorical or a personal experience and a personal kind of theology, all that, even a shared one, I don't mean personal, but one that's less like, and here are the rocks to show it, then it becomes a sort of they said problem. The rise of this literalism, which ties into larger changes in American society, kind of inevitably is going to collide. And when it collides with the likes of us, and when we don't bend, of course, then one answer is going to be, well, clearly they're conspiring with the Illuminati. They're conspiring with Satan. They're conspiring with the dark forces that we're going to have to deal with. That's why they hide the giants, because they don't want to give us our victory.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Right.
And I think,
well, at least that gives me an answer as to why it's important that giants exist.
Yeah, I mean, you guys have been talking about this whole like constant. Where does this conspiracy thing come from? I mean, part of it's just it makes logical sense. It's like every episode of the X-Files. Why don't they prove there's aliens? Because this conspiracy took the evidence. Mm-hmm. So it's a nice out. It's it's like, but it was just a dream in every really poorly written story. Same idea. Conspiracy fits the problem, but the larger thing is if I understand why the world is, and I start to run into elements of the world that don't make sense that way, well, then one, not all logical possible ways out, but one is, well, clearly they're lying to me.
Well, and you get into the psychology of belief. There's another great book called Paranormality out there, mm-hmm. and I'll link to it. It's a great book.
Yeah.
But the whole book, it focuses on why we as human beings believe the things that we believe, crazy or otherwise.
Yeah.
And why it's almost impossible to take someone who is a true believer in these things and convince them of anything other than what they believe. And it's just the way our brains are wired, and it does make it difficult.
Oh, it's a horrible idea to do that. I mean, this is one of these things we talk about with sort of, what should we do about this? You guys are confronting this stuff. You're like, look, here's what this disc is. This is blah, 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 blah. I think that's great. You're not going to convince people that that's a major part of their identity. Who we can hope you would influence would be people who read their stuff.
Right. The fence sitters and the people who have legitimate questions. And when I used to lecture at Gen Con, I would, because it was an incredibly informal situation, there were people from all over, they were not academics for the most part, I would always start my presentation with, if you are a true believer in anything that I am going to go over, there is nothing I am going to say in here that is going to change your mind.
Yeah.
It will not happen. And I never had a problem with that until the last year that I presented. And there was a woman who sat in the front row, and just the whole time she just shook her head and had to make all these disagreeing noises. And I'm just like, you're very distracting, but you're only proving my point.
She clearly made her saving throw roll to disbelieve. So,
right.
Well,
sorry.
Ultimately, I had a Jehovah's Witness knock on my door the other day, and as few people as they convince that they're right, I bet you fewer of the people whose doors are knocked on convince them that they're wrong. So
Yeah, I'm always amazed that that's a viable system for them. I'm just like, really?
Marketing strategy?
Do you,
I don't know.
Right, how many people do you actually convert? I want to see the numbers.
But I'll tell you, Jeb, tenure is a wonderful thing because, well, here's why. We're talking about, what actions these folks take in reaction to our trying to convince them that the data don't support their worldview. I haven't received, but my dean, the dean of arts and sciences, receives fairly frequently letters from people who have either read my book or seen me on TV who demand that I be fired because of the horrible things that I'm saying. And it's amazing. And my dean, I get along with very well, and I've got tenure. She sends these to me just for a laugh. But I can imagine somebody without tenure having to explain to a dean who maybe isn't as sympathetic to what we do, having to explain to that dean, but this was why I was responding to these claims. This is why, as an archaeologist, I feel compelled to respond to these claims about the Nephilim and the Watchers and Atlantis and ancient aliens. And I wonder if ultimately it's going to cause more of our colleagues to say, you know what, I'm better off not. I'm gonna look at my Mesoamerican pottery, but I am not going to say anything that's going to offend anybody.
Well,
that's a good point.
I think there's probably a truth to that. Although I'll come back to that in a minute. Because actually I won't. I'll try to split and not lose both ways. One thing I'll tell you is I see increasingly younger archaeology, including like grad students and whatnot. Now, maybe they kind of give up on it, but who are very interested in dealing with this. And, we've talked about this as kind of this new engagement, how there appears to be this increasing engagement with it. If nothing else, they grew up in the same media sphere.
Right.
That we, in search of and all this stuff. They grew up with this stuff, and now there are dissertations that are being written about it. Whereas before there really weren't. I created a bibliography a few years ago. It hasn't been updated in the last couple of years of pretty much every dissertation and master's thesis I could find on sort of paranormal topics. I taught a course on this at Tulane, and I'm writing about it. But I created this bibliography. It's on my not my website, my old blog, which I don't use. I stopped blogging when I got my job for the reasons you mentioned.
Right.
But now I'm writing with presses, so I think I've made that decision either way, and I'll come back to that.
Sure.
But there are increasingly, if nothing else, the fact that it's in our media more has made it okay for people to be able to do. I thought it very seriously before this was something I thought about in college, like 20 years ago, when I was like, somebody needs to go do an ethnography of UFO people. This is like before it blew up in the 90s. It was in the early 90s. It's just as it began to, I'm like, this is going to blow up. I should seriously consider it. But I'm like, there must be more jobs in archaeology.
Good luck with that, right?
But as I was about to say,
if you find one, let me know.
Well, so to Ken's, to kind of answer Ken's topic, answer Ken's question, I have this history of making terrible decisions, and so tenure or not, I'm working on a book with it's under contract, it's not finished, with University of Mexico Press, tentatively titled Spooky Archaeology. Why, when I say I'm an archaeologist, I hear Mummy's Curse, Holy Grail, Noah's Ark, ancient aliens, why everybody does, why is this? And so it's looking at that topic. So I'm going to get it regardless, whether I have, and I suspect, the people here are great, so I'm not worried about anything sympathetic in that regard. But as I warned my advisor at some point when I was in grad school, if I don't end up with a job, I'm very good at this whole pseudo-archaeology thing.
Right.
Do you understand what I could do? He gave me more respect after that. So, I think my letters probably. I think my letters probably got better.
Yeah, I wish I could. I wish I could put away everything and just jump on the bandwagon, because I really think, knowing what I know, I could probably make a pretty penny.
Here's the funny thing about that, though. I can't tell. I think if you're in the TV business, like running these shows, you do.
Yeah.
The so-called talent. And I don't mean that in like that they're not talented, although I may mean that in specific cases that I'm not going to specify. But the fact that they're not really paid for these shows. They do it in many cases to do not the talk show circuit, but like the convention circuit.
Sure.
Like they'll do like, ghost chasers of whatever so that they can then go to Paranormal Con 99, or 2015 or whatever in blankety blank, wherever, and get a fee and sell a bunch of books that they own. But I don't think many of them make any real money.
I don't know, man. Some of the pseudo-archaeology people, one in particular I'm thinking of, just the pictures that you see of, his lab and other things like that. I mean,
the fact that they have a lab is frankly surprising. Whoever
I know. I mean, there's some money that's there, and I mean, the show. I mean, they ship him all over the world without a moment's, just there, go.
Yeah.
And I'm like, there's a lot of money they're dumping into some of these shows, which means some of these people are getting paid well.
They're dumping.
I don't know.
Jeb, we talked about this whole, practicing science. You gotta if you're a scientist, you have to have a lab. It could be in the guy's basement, but it's got to look authentic because scientists have labs.
And it does, just from the few shots I've seen of it, it does look pretty impressive. But you're right, it could just be the corner of his basement that's just, well lit.
Well, let me ask you, there's two ways in pseudo-archaeology you can go with the lab. You can either go with, it's not going to be like old computers and, posters and coffee mugs. It's not going to be an actual lab.
Right.
It's either going to be dark lighting and like brightly lit screens like hackers use in movies, and blue lighting and all that. So it's either going to be that, or it's going to be Victorian paneling and masks and maps. And
lots of brass
and fedoras and
all right.
and the Explorers Club. So which one was it?
Look, you people and your steampunk hating. All right.
Oh no!
Knock it off. Do not mock the steampunk, okay? That's my subculture. I'm defending it right now.
Profiles in CRM, a weekly podcast. Ask CRM professionals 8 simple questions. The first questions establish education, location, and experience. The last questions are a reflection of that experience, and the answers will surprise you. Check out the show on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/profiles. On that page, you can also request to be interviewed for the show. It only takes 20 minutes, and you don't need any special equipment. Let's get back to the show.
Yeah, as long as you don't conduct science by its rules, I think it's fantastic.
Well, the steampunk, I'm fascinated by the title that you put on one of your articles, because steampunk for me it's play. I would in no way ever try to sell what I was doing or the character that I've created for the steampunk reality that we have here. It's not scientific, and that's the whole point. I mean, she's totally a pseudo-archaeologist. It's all about looking for these lost continents and fake people. And I mean, that's an outlet for me. I would never try to sell that as actual science, which is why I'm fascinated. Like, who have you run into that? Like, it's steampunking science and trying to sell it for real.
Let me give you an example. I'm using it as a metaphor in the article, but it's not an inapt one. Basically the reason, and this actually ties into what we're talking about, I think, because I'm not sure what that would be at this point, but
just go with it, Jeb.
I know. I mean,
sorry, I got you off topic.
Yeah, but no. This is actually on topic. So the article, I mean, basically, if you look at these various fields, what they often do is they often replicate the sort of state of the science when these fields were just beginning to emerge. So cryptozoology, in essence, is kind of, sorta, a caricature of bringing back alive natural history from the Victorian era, the Great White Hunter. Not ecological survey, not, carrying capacities, but natives saw this thing. We're going to go get it. Pseudo-archaeology, I mean, that one's obvious. You guys have talked about it. We've been talking about it. It pretty much plays purely Victorian tropes, Victorian colonialist tropes, theosophy, all these sorts of things. Ufology, the UFO people, they harken back not to the Victorians, but to the beginning of aerospace, to the 1940s and 50s, and that very kind of World War II to early Cold War mentality. And in all of these, and here's where the steampunk thing comes in. It wasn't random, though I figured it might get a few hits on it. But the reason I did it is if you look at one of the core kind of political ethos to the philosophy, it plays on this very vibrant sort of Victorian idea of the explosion of science and of the sort of freedom of mechanics. Like, you want to go build an aeroplane, go do it in your garage. No one's going to stop you. And so steampunk very much has meshed with the DIY, with the maker movement and all of that.
Yes.
You know, calling Cory Doctorow. But
steampunk is very DIY. It's very maker. It is an intersection of a lot of handicrafts and that kind of craft.
Then let me ask you this. I mean, I'd be Socratic, which my students always hate. What is, if there is one piece of technology, and I'll give you a hint, it was in the news today. If there's one piece of very iconic technology today that steampunks constantly complain about as sort of a symbol of modern technology that they don't like, what is it usually? You may know what I'm hinting at.
That we complain about.
They use them. They complain on them.
The cell phones, the computers and cell phones.
And specifically iPhones.
Yeah.
Why? Because they're black slabs that you can't tell how they work. You can't use them. And in certain models and brands, you can't fix them. You can't modify them. We used to call it jailbreaking if you wanted to touch their operating system at all or change it to carriers. And in some versions of these things, the battery is glued in. You can't touch it. You have to send it back to the corporation, and you buy things on it through a company store that limits what you can do.
That's why I don't use that brand.
Precisely. That is everything that steampunks hate.
You can't personalize it and interact with it.
Right, and you can't tell how it works. It's basically a magic black box that you don't own. You rent the use of it. Somebody else owns it.
I'm afraid we're getting off topic with technology.
Yeah.
As much as I love it.
Well, no, it comes back. It comes back. So steampunks are all like, you know what? I want to see a machine and how it actually works. I want to have a machine that I can tweak, that I control, that isn't me just renting space on somebody's network to basically farm me like a serf. Now, I think there is a lot to be said for that. When you turn it to science, though, that's why all this stuff, all these Victorian pseudo-archaeologists, the fact that pseudo-archaeologists rely on them isn't because they have to. It's because they symbolize a sort of cognitive ability to do what the hell you want. Nobody is going to,
right?
Yeah, it's a freedom from authority. And that authority is what we call responsibility to the data and to scientific methods. Professionalization.
Mm-hmm.
They don't... Go ahead.
I see that. I see that. That's good.
Yeah.
I see how you connected that.
They don't want to do that. They basically don't want to be told that that's wrong. And so this appeals, and so they hearken back either literally in many cases or symbolically in the safari clothes and in the expeditions. Nobody talking about going on expeditions anymore. They're like, oh yeah, we're in the third year of the project, the third field season. No, we're going on an expedition. You know who goes on expeditions? Alan Quatermain goes on expeditions.
Right.
Indiana Jones goes on expeditions. You know, those people, and Professor Elemental goes on expeditions, okay?
Ah, bless you.
Yeah,
bless
and so that's the thing. They're reaching for these because they're reacting to modernity and they're reacting to the professionalization of science in the 20th century when the gatekeepers get added.
So it's like science punk.
Yeah, but with not... I don't want to...
But without actually using science.
Yeah. I
wonder
using
if
the symbols of
their
science.
I wonder if their claim would be they're democratizing science.
Oh, it would be. And so,
absolutely.
Science is a democracy. That's the problem.
Well, but here's the thing is Ken knows exactly who I'm talking about, but there are certain people that bring up some legitimate points. I don't disagree with them on everything inside the profession of archaeology.
Right.
You know exactly who I'm talking about.
Of course, yeah.
Who argue that attacking pseudo-archaeology is anti-democratic, it's squelching voices, and Ken's response to this, and other people have responded to this to go, have you met these people? And you know what? In certain contexts, in certain national traditions of archaeology and alternative archaeologies, I am actually more sympathetic to it because it's not as extreme. Again, getting back to our topic of sort of this literal, very religious in many contexts, and very kind of nasty conspiratorial in many contexts. because you can be alternative and not have those things. And then it's usually not butting heads as much with science. But there are people who are like, you're being too nasty and negative and exclusionary in your scientism. And they accuse people like that of being of being the same thing. They're like, you're just using the symbols of science. You're like beating people over the head with Popperian hypothetico-deductive reasoning. And
nice.
And I think
you're
there's
oppressing other alternative interpretations of the past.
And I think
we are oppressors.
And Ken and I differ a little in that I think there has been. I don't think there's much of one now, and there is some. But I think there has been some small truth to that. I mean, an example, Great Zimbabwe, which for decades, even though Gertrude Catton Thompson proved in 1928 that it was built in the medieval era by indigenous sub-Saharan Africans, the government of Rhodesia was for decades with its scientific authority saying, no, white people built this because apartheid.
Right.
So we can all think of examples like that. So I think there's been, and there's more subtle ones. As I always tell my classes, if you ever need an extreme thing, let's go to the Nazis. But, there are more subtle ones, and we've been guilty of them, and we probably still are. But
see, that's the beauty to me. That's the true beauty of science, because yes, there have been these situations, but we know of them because they have either self-corrected or they have been browbeaten into being corrected, because that's what science does. It's one of the very few things that is actually truly self-correcting.
Right.
It may take a few years, maybe even a few decades, but it will correct itself.
Absolutely. The thing I would protest against those arguments, and I'm not unsympathetic to them depending on the context, that's talking about indigenous voices or basically non-white male voices that have been excluded and are still excluded due to structural issues, is not the same thing as saying you're mean because you won't accept or you won't listen in a democratic sense to people who say, oh, look, the Nephilim built stargates under Babylon.
Yeah, no, but the problem is sometimes people can't see the difference. And I blame that on the lack of, as I always do, I blame that on the lack of teaching critical thinking in the school systems.
And so that's why I wrote my article as a sort of, looking at various different of these kind of ology fields that all the in search of fields, these discovery fields, as Christopher Bader and company call them in Paranormal America. They're all very similar, and I think to, on the one hand, not say that argument is wrong, because again, I'm sympathetic to it in some ways, not in a lot of ways, but in some ways I very much am, and say, look, you're dealing with one thing. This really is something else, and to show you it's something else, let's look at its intellectual cousins, and in some cases, its intellectual siblings or spouses or however you want to do the kinship chart, and kind of like back away, like step back a little and realize, you know what, there is a problem, and saying, look, your squelching multivocality should not then be carte blanche to say, but aliens did it.
Right.
Okay, well, Jeb, this has been amazing, and I would love to have you back.
Out of this, huh?
I do. I actually let it run long because I knew I could get 2 shows out of this.
We'll pay you double, Jeb. So you get time and a half for overtime.
I think that's mathematically sound. So
time and a half of 0.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
You could just consider the check in the mail.
Yeah, no, it's been fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and like I said, I'd love to have you back on. There were some other topics that you brought up in email.
And there's some other ones I haven't mentioned yet that we could, maybe some more case-based ones that we might be able to talk about in the future.
Sure. Yeah, definitely.
I'll sort of tease that.
But this is a great introduction to that, though, to a context for these specific case-based discussions, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just want to say thank you for being on both shows now, and thank you, Ken, for being on both shows.
This was great. I knew that Jeb would give us some really good talking points here, so that's awesome.
I know my extreme things that I generally shouldn't talk about in polite company very well.
There you go.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Jeb. It was great. Just fantastic stuff.
All right.
All these things we make no apology are the study of archaeology. but we don't do dinosaurs.
Thanks for listening. We hope you've enjoyed it. Our music was provided by Archaeosuit Productions. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Stitcher and share us wherever you use social media. You can contact us with your questions, comments, or angry email at archifantasies@gmail.com. You can follow the podcast at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archifantasies. You can follow the blog at www.archifantasies.com and get updates on Tumblr and Twitter at archifantasies. You can also look for us on Facebook. If you're looking for the show notes for this episode, go to the podcast website at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archifantasies. Thanks again for listening.
No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
And Romans, human evolution makes us smile.